It was a hot August night in 2019, inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center, a federal detention facility tucked away in lower Manhattan, isolated from the noise of the world beyond its walls. Correctional officers were supposed to be making their rounds, or at least that was the plan. It was well past midnight. Silence had settled over the corridors. Due to a reported technical malfunction, several security cameras in the relevant wing had stopped recording. Exactly when they failed was unknown, but two correctional officers assigned to conduct checks every 30 minutes had not done so for several hours. Both officers would write the same excuse in their reports the following morning. They had fallen asleep. In the early hours of that morning, when the cell door was finally opened, the most closely monitored inmate in the world was no longer alive. Jeffrey Epstein had been awaiting trial on federal charges, including the sexual abuse of minors. Welcome to Classified Hidden Histories. I'm your host. On this channel, we go behind the official explanations, pulling at the threads of sealed documents, disappeared witnesses, and the deals made in the dark by governments and institutions that would rather stay invisible. Tonight we open one of the most talked about and least understood cases of the modern era, the Jeffrey Epstein file. This is not a collection of conspiracy theories. This is a story built from court records, investigative journalism, survivor testimony, and 2 decades of documents that powerful people worked very hard to keep out of public view. And the picture they paint is not a clean one. Every major scandal begins with a small crack in the official story. In the Epstein case, that crack appeared in 2005, in Palm Beach, Florida. That year, several young women who had worked at Epstein's South Florida mansion came forward and filed complaints with local police. What they described was deeply serious, but the case did not move at the speed you might expect. The Palm Beach Police Department launched an investigation. Detectives interviewed dozens of witnesses, collected victim statements, and assembled a detailed criminal file. According to their own prosecutors, this file was strong enough to put Epstein away for decades. Then the file was transferred from the Palm Beach State Attorney's Office to federal prosecutors. And that is where something changed. In 2008, federal prosecutor Alexander Acosta negotiated an arrangement with Jeffrey Epstein that was, to put it plainly, extraordinary. Epstein would be shielded from federal prosecution. At the state level, he would plead guilty to 2 charges and receive an 18-month sentence, half of which he could serve under a work release program, leaving the facility for up to 12 hours a day. 18 months, and he could go home every day. What made the deal even more striking was a specific clause buried in the agreement: Epstein's unnamed co-conspirators, individuals whose identities were not publicly disclosed, would also be covered by the same immunity. People who were never named, never charged, quietly protected. Dozens of survivors were never informed the deal was being made. That alone was later ruled a violation of federal law. Those questions went largely unanswered for nearly a decade, until 2018, when investigative reporter Julie K. Brown published a landmark series in the Miami Herald that forced the case back into public consciousness and refused to let it go quietly. To understand Jeffrey Epstein, you have to go back a few steps. Born in 1953 in a modest neighborhood in Brooklyn, Epstein showed an early aptitude for mathematics that set him apart. He completed high school ahead of schedule and enrolled at Cooper Union, then New York University, to study math. He did not graduate from either institution. This would become one of the more curious footnotes of his biography, because despite never completing a degree, he was hired in 1974 as a math teacher at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite private institutions. The parents of his students included some of the most powerful figures on Wall Street. Epstein, it turned out, was extraordinarily good at using connections. Within a few years, he had moved into Bear Stearns, the investment bank, rising to the level of partner before departing to manage what he described as his own private wealth fund, J. Epstein and Company. Almost no one outside his immediate circle fully understood what the fund actually did. The client list was never made public. Instead, Epstein's profile rose through photographs taken alongside the world's most powerful people, through the events he attended and through the properties he accumulated: a 5-story townhouse in Manhattan, a 28-room estate in Palm Beach, a private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands, Little St. James, a sprawling ranch in New Mexico, millions of dollars in donations to prestigious institutions, including Harvard University. Those donations opened doors. They bought credibility. They built a wall of respectability around a man whose private life, according to the women who eventually came forward, bore no resemblance to the philanthropist image he had carefully constructed. Virginia Roberts Giuffre spent years gathering the courage to tell her story publicly. In the late 1990s, as a teenager working in Palm Beach, she was approached by a woman named Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell was the daughter of the late British media mogul Robert Maxwell, and she had long been Epstein's closest associate, described by many as his partner, his social director, and the person who shaped his access to the powerful world he inhabited. According to Giuffre, Maxwell approached her with promises of better employment opportunities and drew her into Epstein's circle. What followed, she said, was years of exploitation that she was manipulated and coerced into through a combination of psychological control, financial dependency, and fear. In court filings and sworn depositions made over the years, Giuffre alleged that she had been trafficked by Epstein and Maxwell to other men as well. Men whose names, when they eventually appeared in legal documents, sent shockwaves through several countries. One of those names was Prince Andrew, Duke of York, a senior member of the British royal family. Another was Alan Dershowitz, the prominent Harvard Law School professor and celebrity defense attorney. Both men categorically denied the allegations. Prince Andrew gave a widely criticized BBC interview in 2019 in which he stated he had no memory of ever meeting Giuffre and offered an explanation for his whereabouts that many found implausible. Dershowitz produced extensive legal arguments in his own defense and filed counter-complaints against those he accused of fabricating the claims. But the questions did not go away. Because there were flight logs, logs showing who had traveled aboard Epstein's private Boeing 727, and because there were nearly 400 pages of sealed court documents from a 2015 civil case. Documents that were briefly unsealed, then locked away again. In July 2019, roughly a year after Julie K. Brown's reporting reignited public pressure, Epstein was arrested again in New York. Prosecutors from the Southern District of New York alleged that Epstein had sexually abused dozens of underage girls between 2002 and 2005. New trial dates were set. Witnesses were being lined up. And then, on the morning of the August 10th, 2019, everything stopped. Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The New York City medical examiner ruled the death a suicide by hanging. But forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden, who conducted an independent examination on behalf of Epstein's estate, stated publicly that the injuries he observed were more consistent with homicidal strangulation than with self-inflicted hanging. He cited specific fractures in the hyoid bone and surrounding structures. Two official assessments. Two different conclusions. Epstein had been found semi-conscious in his cell just 2 weeks earlier, with marks on his neck. He had been placed on suicide watch. Then that watch was removed. Why? Who authorized the removal? How did the cameras fail on that specific night in that specific wing? The FBI opened an investigation. As of the time this episode was produced, that investigation remains officially open. No charges, no convictions, no answers, just silence. One of the elements that makes the Epstein case so difficult to contain within any single narrative is its geography. Little St. James Island sits in the U.S. Virgin Islands, but the guests who allegedly visited it came from across the world. At this point, it is important to address some of the most prominent names associated with the case, honestly and with the precision the evidence actually supports. Former President Bill Clinton's name appeared in Epstein's flight logs. This is documented fact. Clinton's office acknowledged that he had flown on Epstein's aircraft approximately 26 times. His representatives have consistently stated that Secret Service personnel were present on those trips, and that he had no knowledge of or involvement in Epstein's crimes. Former President Donald Trump had been photographed with Epstein at social events in the 1980s and 1990s. In a 2002 magazine interview, Trump described Epstein in terms that would later draw significant scrutiny. In later years, Trump stated that he'd cut ties with Epstein and supported the 2019 prosecution. In 2021, Virginia Giuffre filed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew in U.S. federal court. The parties reached an out-of-court settlement in 2022. Prince Andrew admitted no wrongdoing. But shortly afterward, Queen Elizabeth stripped him of his military titles and royal patronages. None of the prominent individuals whose names appeared in the case files faced criminal prosecution. For many of them, not even a formal investigation was opened. And that is what leads so many people back to the same fundamental question. Why? One of the layers that has made the Epstein case particularly resistant to simple explanations is the question of possible intelligence connections. Ghislaine Maxwell was the daughter of Robert Maxwell, a media baron with documented ties to Israeli military intelligence. What is disputed, and what remains unproven, is whether Epstein's network itself had any operational relationship with any intelligence service. Some researchers and former intelligence officials have noted that networks of this kind have historically been used in compromat operations. What is on the record? Epstein maintained a black book, a physical address book eventually obtained by investigators, containing thousands of names and contact numbers across government, finance, academia, and entertainment. Also on the record, Epstein funded scientific research at institutions including Harvard and MIT through donations often made after his 2008 conviction. Donations that several of those institutions later said they would not have accepted had they understood their source. Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested in July 2020. After months of legal proceedings, she was convicted in December 2021 on 5 federal counts including sex trafficking of a minor. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. But throughout the trial, the larger question of who else had been involved was largely kept out of the courtroom. No additional co-defendants were charged. Maxwell did not cooperate with investigators, she did not name names, and the network, as a network, was never formally prosecuted. In January 2024, a U.S. federal court released approximately 900 pages of previously sealed documents related to civil proceedings connected to the Epstein case. Names appeared, dozens of them, but context matters here. The vast majority appeared as witnesses or as names mentioned in testimony, not as accused parties. A smaller number appeared in contexts that were considerably more serious, but even those documents were not complete. Some pages remained redacted, some names remained unreadable, and some questions, the ones that have circled this case since the beginning, remained unanswered. So how should we read all of this? 3 different frameworks present themselves, and being honest about this case means acknowledging all 3. The first framework. Epstein was an extraordinarily skilled financial predator whose wealth and connections shielded him from accountability for decades. The 2008 plea deal was the product of institutional failure and historical deference to the wealthy, but not necessarily a coordinated cover-up from above. His death was a catastrophic convergence of negligence and bad luck. This is roughly the framework that official investigations have pointed toward. The second framework, the protection Epstein received, was not incidental to his wealth. He was a broker, someone who facilitated access, gathered information, and used that information as currency. The 2008 deal was a deliberate act of self-protection by people with something to lose. His death was not random. This framework is not proven. But the number of unanswered questions it would explain is not small. The third framework is the most speculative. That Epstein was an operational asset of one or more intelligence services, that his network was designed as a tool of geopolitical leverage, that his death was a decision made at the highest possible level. Most serious researchers treat this framework with considerable caution. The honest answer is that we cannot yet choose definitively between these frameworks, because the documents are still partly sealed, because the names are still partly hidden, because the questions are still unanswered. What the Epstein case has forced into public consciousness is something broader and more uncomfortable. It is a case about how institutions protect themselves, how wealth creates distance from consequences, how the machinery of justice can be slowed, redirected, or quietly stopped when the people implicated have enough reach. The survivors, Virginia Giuffre, chief among them, spent years being dismissed, disbelieved, and legally intimidated. They faced some of the most powerful legal teams in the world. They did not go away. Without their persistence, the 2008 deal might never have been exposed. Without Julie K. Brown's journalism, there may have been no 2019 arrest, and what remains unresolved is still substantial. The full client list has never been officially released. The question of who authorized Epstein's removal from Suicide Watch has never been satisfactorily answered. The FBI investigation remains open with no public resolution. Perhaps the most unsettling truth about the Epstein case is this. Even what the public has been allowed to see is enough to raise serious questions about the integrity of the systems meant to deliver justice. What remains hidden may tell an even more disturbing story. Or it may tell a quieter one. We don't know. And that, in its own way, is the most honest thing that can be said about this file. A note on this episode. Some scenes and transitions have been dramatized for narrative clarity. The information presented draws from publicly available court documents, investigative journalism including the work of Julie K. Brown and Ronan Farrow, survivor testimony entered into legal proceedings, and reporting from multiple news organizations. Not all details in this case have been conclusively established, and where allegations remain contested or unproven, they have been framed as such. Our aim is not to reach a verdict, but to map what is known, what is disputed, and what remains buried. If you want us to keep following files like this one, subscribe to Classified Hidden Histories, and make sure notifications are on so you never miss what we uncover next.